Hi there, and welcome to another episode of our BigLipz podcast. This is our third episode, and I'll be hosting this one. My name is Sam Macaulay Blair, and I am joined as ever by the lovely Catherine Morris.
Hello.
Again, as ever, the two of us are sort of basically university film graduates who have had the good fortune of graduating in the middle of a pandemic. So there's not a lot in terms of filmmaking that we can do. Instead, we found ourselves doing a bi-weekly podcast. This week's episode, the third episode, is going to feature basically the structure is going to be classic and contemporary. Through our discussions, we've kind of noticed that there are a heap of films, both old and new, that sort of share sort of similar DNA. Either it's themes or sort of stylistic choices, or even narrative choices. In fact, in our first episode, we found ourselves noting that the 2019 movie Midsommar, was in many ways carried the spirit on. There was an embodiment of the Wicker Man, the sort of 1970s classic, and Christopher Nolan's Interstellar was another one, which in many ways took a lot from Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, which basically opened up this discussion and forced us to sit down and kind of come up with a list of ones that we thought were both pretty strong and ones that we thought were fairly interesting, ones that haven't really been discussed much elsewhere as far as we've seen. So hopefully for anyone watching this, there is some new discoveries for you, and you may agree with some of the decisions, you may disagree with them. It would be interesting to hear some feedback on that. Cool. So I will get right off the bat then and jump into the first pairing, which is the classic 1980s horror film from John Carpenter, The Thing, starring Kurt Russell, and the 2016, I think it was,
15.
2015 Quentin Tarantino movie, The Hateful Eight, which also stars Kurt Russell. So I will now pass over to Catherine for your thoughts on the two movies.
Yeah, perfect. I think the most, apart from the fact that they are two different genres, because obviously The Thing is like a kind of sci-fi horror and The Hateful Eight's a western.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I think they're actually like really similar, especially most notably would obviously be the themes of like isolation, which then lead into paranoia, this kind of sense of like unrelenting danger and fear and violence and things like that. I think it's funny as well because obviously Tarantino's very renowned for violence and gore and stuff like that. And The Thing is probably one of the goriest movies I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And it's just
very
like
difficult to watch at times.
Yep, and it's like unapologetically gory. Much in the same way that Tarantino is as well, where he's just very much like, no, we're just gonna fill this scene full of fake blood, and John Carpenter's obviously been like, no, this is a monster who's very scary and is going to take over your body and it's going to be horrible. I think as well, obviously dealing with isolation, they're both sets of characters are like in The Thing, they're stuck in a science base in the middle of Antarctica. Tarantino, they're stuck at a stagecoach stop.
Yeah.
Again in the middle of a blizzard, so there's that kind of a dual setting of like snow blizzard. And that itself poses like a danger because you can't, like especially in The Hateful Eight, you can't go out and wander about in the blizzard because there's a bit when someone does and he almost dies and they have to set up like the lines to go to and from the toilet kind of thing. This thing in, I read an interview with Tarantino as well where he was talking about he wanted like this feeling of paranoia and isolation to, because you kind of, especially in Tarantino's, you kind of see it's kind of like a wide shot of like the whole haberdashery and you see everyone in it. So from that you can see all of the four walls, well not the four walls, you are the fourth wall, but you can see the three walls and the ceiling and the floor, so you can see the whole space that they're in, which makes it feel that much more cramped because there's nowhere for people to.
A really good point, actually. I never even thought of that. The fact that you can literally get the entire room onto one shot, so it does immediately let you know that it's a very, very cramped location. There's no space, and that sort of coupled with like you were saying, like the sort of snow outside, the movie does a very well. Both films do a very good job of establishing that they're in small locations and that going outside, like leaving that environment, is not an option.
Which makes it also scary because staying in the environment also isn't an option.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
they
exactly.
there's nowhere for them to go. I think as well it's interesting, like in the Hateful Eight, no one really knows each other except the little crew of like the people who are already there.
Yeah.
Whereas the new people, Kurt Russell and Samuel Jackson, and that they're not friends, but they kind of need to work together
Yes.
to figure out who the bad guy is, basically. Whereas in The Thing, they're maybe not friends, but they're all like colleagues, so they all have a prior history as well, which I think both of them, though they're different, also makes it scary, because the thing with your colleagues, you're meant to know them, and then once they start turning into the Thing, it's almost like you never knew them because you can't decipher when they're them or when they're the Thing.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Very interesting, the fact that like one focuses on the fact that you can't trust these familiar relationships, whereas the other one is more about, okay, well, these characters don't really know each other, but that then means that they've got nothing. They both kind of got boiled down to the same thing of like, you can't really tell who's lying and who's not, because like if they don't know each other, if they don't have like a pre-existing relationship, then it's pretty difficult to find out who is being honest, who's being genuine, whose stories, like, because again, it's not like they can search for references, or they can they have anyone to vouch for each other. It's all like intensely like paranoid in different ways, but at the same time the kind of essence of it is the same.
I think you mentioned obviously Kurt Russell's in both. I thought it was like when you watch, because I've rewatched The Thing recently, and he's kind of like the hero in it. He's kind of like the main guy. You're kind of on his side and rooting for him not to be the Thing.
Yeah.
Whereas in The Hateful Eight, he's not a very likable character. And I think especially if you're used to having seen the Thing, and then you watch The Hateful Eight, the fact that Kurt Russell dies is even more shocking, because you don't see him die in The Thing.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Like he's effectively the last one standing in The Thing, and to have him killed off. Again, again, it's been a while since I've watched The Hateful Eight. He's the first one to get killed off in The Hateful Eight.
Yeah, he's the one that gets poisoned by the coffee.
Yeah, so it really is like, yeah, it's the movie is very, very obviously leaning into The Thing. And it's almost like Kurt Russell. You feel like you're safe with Kurt Russell because you're like, oh, he made it out The Thing.
Yeah.
I think he's like the first character introduced really as well. So you kind of think like, okay, well, like this character's not going anywhere, and then halfway through the film, he is gone.
Exactly. Yeah. Like even the way, like I was reading again about Tarantino, and he said that he made all of the cast, including Kurt Russell, watch The Thing. So I think Tarantino's funny because he tends to do just more like just copies people as opposed to takes little. I think this pairing, maybe more so than other ones, is very much like Tarantino's watched The Thing and been like, that's amazing, I'm going to make that into my movie as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's funny because obviously they did, I think it was 2011, they did a prequel / remake to The Thing, which wasn't very good. And that's, I remember there being like an uproar at the time, because ultimately The Thing is an absolute classic and is iconic in so many ways, and it's kind of like, it's untouchable. Like you can't really, it's been done perfectly before, so you can't, you couldn't ever get another crew and top what they've done. So just by taking the entire like essence and sort of frame of the movie and just, like you said, like transposing it onto a different genre, by making it a Western, it's insane how much he kind of gets away with. Completely just doing the same thing, making like a few sort of artistic tweaks here and there, but ultimately it has just made the same film. And like it's funny that I also wasn't aware that he'd made the cast, including Kurt Russell, sit and watch The Thing, as if Kurt Russell had no awareness of The Thing.
Yeah, like Tarantino's bringing it to him like, wait till you see this movie, by the way, it's so good.
Absolute classic, and I love it.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. And it's again, yeah, like Tarantino, like you say, does kind of like he likes to see something and go, that's brilliant, and then just effectively just does the exact same thing, but he does
Yep.
it in sort of such a stylized way and such a brilliant way. And again, he is, I think as well, because he writes his own things, and he's sort of renowned for his sort of dialogue, which, lengthy monologues and quirky and interesting characters with like their moments that he's able to take something that exists and remake it, but like in his hands it feels completely new. But at the same time, and it didn't hit me at first watching the Hateful Eight. Like I was, any film about paranoia and isolation in the snow is going to give me like Slight Thing vibes. But it wasn't until like afterwards seeing the movie, I remember kind of like actually piecing together just how much they were exactly the same.
Yeah, I'd say so, because it maybe wasn't until you've watched the Hateful Eight, you watched the thing, sorry, after you've watched the Hateful Eight again, that you're like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's almost identical.
Yep,
Because
exactly.
there's even like the opening shots of both film is like someone trekking through the snow for a good 5 minutes.
That's really true, actually. Yeah, there's a lot of just like sort of landscaping and allowing the sort of like, allowing you to bask in the establishing like location shots, and also the soundtrack as well is probably a big thing.
Yeah. Of course, yeah.
And yeah, that's one thing that I became aware of was looking at interviews of Tarantino. He talks about the fact that they had Ennio Morricone who did the soundtrack for The Thing, but moreover, a huge chunk of the soundtrack for The Hateful Eight is just unused written music for The Thing, because apparently Morricone wrote like 3 different scores for The Thing. I think he wrote like an orchestral sort of soundtrack. He wrote I think he wrote a sort of quieter soundtrack, and then he wrote a sort of synthy soundtrack. And obviously, like they went the sort of synthy route with The Thing. I think that meant that he was just like, when he didn't have enough time to score The Hateful Eight, I think he was like, well, I do have sheets and sheets of music that I didn't use for this movie that you're effectively ripping off. So you might as well just like,
fair enough.
in for a penny, you might as well go in for the whole pound and finish.
Exactly. That's funny.
But yeah,
I think as well it's funny. Sorry, going away from like just those 2 movies, and it was just sheer chance that I happened to be on this particular episode of the X-Files. And it's an episode called Ice, and it was almost like it was just like an episode of The Thing. It was so funny.
That's so strange.
Like basically they watch this video, Mulder and Scully, they watch this video, and it's these people, and they've gone mad in this Arctic science base somewhere because they've been digging in the ground and they've found something, and then Scully and Mulder go there, and lo and behold, something is taking over these people, and they go mad, and I'm sure there's even like a dog in it at one point. There is.
That's mental.
The dog's like the first thing to get it, the same as The Thing. It's so funny.
That's so strange. But, and I suppose what was
like it wasn't even trying to.
The X-Files is the 90s as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think like early 90s, yeah.
Yeah, so probably not even that long after the movie had come out then, if The Thing came out in the 80s. A good 10 years later.
I'm sure The Thing, yeah, I'm sure The Thing wasn't massively popular when it came out. It's just turned into more of like a cult thing, so it's weird for them to have seen it and been like, ooh.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I think actually, I think I remember reading somewhere that they reckon the reason The Thing wasn't at all successful in cinemas was because of E.T. And apparently after E.T., people
I read that as well. Yeah,
just wanted nice movies about aliens, and they didn't want a horrible like paranoid, gory movie set in the Arctic, which is a shame because
that's so funny. They couldn't be too different as well.
I know exactly. I can't imagine. It's just weird the way that kind of people's minds work, isn't it? Like I can't. You can like both movies, and it's just that idea that I don't know. It's like a comedy coming out and everyone being like, "Well, that's it. I only want to see people be funny now. I'm not going to see a drama ever again." Such a strange.
It's far too serious.
Yeah, it's changed the way I view movies. It's such a strange response. But yeah, and I mean, it's probably worked out for the best. The way that the Thing has sort of seeped into yeah, it seeps into so many things, and I feel like so many movies and stories have tried to emulate what they kind of did with that film. And there's something that's always, I mean, I the DVD copy I had of the thing, for some reason is just like shrunk down into like a little box when you watch it.
Oh yeah.
But it just kind of adds this. It actually kind of adds a lot to the movie. I always forget that it's like a thing until I stick on the disc and I'm like, why is that so small? But it adds a lot in terms of. It almost makes you feel like you're discovering something that you're not meant to see. Like as if it really happened. So
As if it's like always like lost footage or something in your.
Yeah, exactly. There's something just a little bit like illicit about it, and it's in my head it always kind of does the movie a few favors. Because it does have that feeling of like, again, the movie just really sells itself, or sells the fact that you're in isolation more so than the Hateful Eight, which I think the Hateful Eight does do a really good job of letting you know the characters are in isolation, but I don't think you buy into it as much due to just Tarantino's style. I mean, they have a narrator come in halfway through the movie,
Yeah.
which does remind you that you are watching a film. And then, as much as The Thing is incredibly gory, it's almost gory in like a much more realistic way than the Hateful Eight kind of becomes like pantomime gore.
Yeah, it's always that like bright red, like blood thing that's just everywhere and it's sparking out people. And...
Yeah, and there's sort of like there's a comedic element as well to some of like the gore and the thing, but in the Hateful Eight, it's a bit more played for sort of laughs than I think John Carpenter would have allowed.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I think like that quite nicely captures just the fact that like the two of them are, like basically, like the Hateful Eight is pretty much just like the bastard child of the Thing, come a few decades late. But to move this on, the next comparison we have is a sort of radical departure from the first in terms of tone and genre, which was one which you suggested, which was The Great Escape and Chicken Run.
Yep. I think it was funny because we wanted something like animated as well, just to kind of get away so it wasn't all kind of dark and dreary. And The Chicken Run is just an amazing film. Like,
absolutely
nothing wrong with that film. It's so good. And it's funny because I knew that it was like a kind of parody of The Great Escape, even though I'd never seen The Great Escape all the way through.
Yeah.
So there's different things, like it's managed to take like really iconic moments, like when Ginger's in isolation and she's throwing the tennis ball.
Yeah.
Across that, yeah. And even having not seen that, you know where it's from, so you know that the movie's basically being Hateful Eight, what I'm talking about. The Great Escape.
That would be a very
I think it was funny as well.
If Chicken Run was based on the Hateful Eight.
That'd be grim. Although, rewatching Chicken Run, there's like proper high stakes. Like, they take one of the chickens away and kill her.
Oh, really?
And it's properly like, yeah.
I haven't rewatched it since I was a kid. And I mean, I know that the premise of it's obviously kind of like inherently dark, but it is all about like their lives are on the line because the farmers want to turn them into pies.
Yeah. No, but it's like at the start of the movie, one of the poor chickens isn't laying eggs, so she legit just gets taken away to the chopping block, and you don't see anything, but there's this crazy like silhouette of like the axe going up and the chopping block, and then you hear the thud of it, and all the chickens are like, oh, that's awful. Do you know what, I was rewatching and I was like, this is a children's movie.
Yeah, it opens on a very, very, very dark note then. I know, and it's funny that I don't have this like memory of Chicken Run being this horrific film, but I guess they fire so many jokes in afterwards that you almost forget about the fact that the stakes are like incredibly. Actually, I would say like that alone probably makes it feel like I watched The Great Escape for the first time, and like you were saying like about knowing that Chicken Run was based in The Great Escape. I have no idea where like I found that out. I have no idea where I first heard that, but I feel like I've always known that Chicken Run is based in The Great Escape, despite never having seen like a second of The Great Escape until I watched it recently. And I was kind of struck by just like I always kind of thought The Great Escape would be a bit more serious than it is. I always thought like you know, it's about people escaping from, I guess, like soldiers escaping from like a Nazi camp, and I naturally assumed that like that would be quite like a sort of heavy subject, and there would be generally when you have movies about like people in prison somewhere, you know, things like something like the Shawshank Redemption, they really sell you on the fact that like, okay, these people need to get out of this place, like this place is like unlivable. But in The Great Escape, they kind of like they just, I mean, they're kind of having fun with the film the whole way through. But even like the sort of the head German who runs the camp generally is a pretty nice guy. Like it kind of as an opening proposal to them is that they just he knows that they've all like everyone in the camp has like tried to escape or like temporarily escaped from like other camps that they've been in, and he kind of is just like, well, like, you know what, we can make this camp as comfortable for you as possible. You know, we can let you like take part in lessons and like gardening and stuff like that, and make sure that you're just kind of like occupied. And really, he's like, we can all effectively just sit out the war, because he's like, we're here as well. You know, like we have to stay and run this camp, so we can make it as good as possible. And generally, he's like pretty polite through the whole thing. So I never really felt like the stakes in The Great Escape were that high.
So would you say that Chicken Run was more intense than The Great Escape?
I genuinely would, especially if it opens with decapitation.
Yeah, true.
You do have someone getting gunned down in The Great Escape, but it comes because they're literally trying to run out of the prison. Like, I'm not, you know, I don't want to come across as a Nazi sympathizer here, but generally, like in the context of that film, I don't think the film does a very good job of like giving you a reason to really like hate them.
Yeah.
Which is just, again, I just wasn't expecting that. Like the movie seems to almost just like open up and it's like, well, you know, they're German, so they're obviously the bad guys. And doesn't
Yeah.
really do much to like to make you believe it. And it's just like that's a
so
bit
funny.
strange. Yeah, like
I think that's funny as well, because the villain in Chicken Run, Mrs. Tweedy, is horrifying. She's so scary. I remember being scared as a child, and I watched it recently and I was like, God, she is very scary.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, and I again was so aware of like Chicken Run having like a proper compelling villain, one that you are like, you are intimidated by. Yeah, I was just like every single scene with like that German, like I wish I knew his name, but every single scene where he's just like generally being really nice, I'm like, what's going on? Like, is this guy ever just gonna do something? He's supposed to be a Nazi, like.
Yeah, you're just waiting for him to do something awful.
Exactly, and even like there's even a part of the film where like I mean, it's based on real events, and a bunch of soldiers who had escaped get gunned down, and even he's the one that then has to relay that to like sort of superior officers. He had nothing. It makes it seem like he had nothing to do with like them getting gunned down, but he is the one that has to sort of relay it to like British superior officers. And he seemed genuinely sympathetic about it and really apologetic and kind of flustered. And I'm like, again, like he genuinely seems to be upset about this. Like the movie did like almost more to get me on his side than anyone else's side. Like they don't really do that much in the way of like character work. They kind of just have everyone be a bit kind of cheeky and playful. But like he was the only one that I was like, he genuinely seemed to have like quite good intentions in a lot of places, and he's a Nazi.
Like he's the most well-rounded character out of them all. That's concerning.
It was very bizarre. So yeah, they obviously went a very different direction with the villain in Chicken Run. But yeah, that being said, there is obviously like a lot. I mean, the whole essence of the story about them being locked up somewhere and having to escape is obviously translated. Obviously, you have like the American coming in and riding around on a motorbike as well at points. Even just stylistically, there's a lot of like callbacks to The Great Escape, and like the way they design the hatches and the huts, and their sort of escape mechanism kind of resembles the tunnels. You have like the Scottish...
Yeah, because there's one point when Ginger's like in a tunnel and she's like pulling herself along.
That's right.
To try and escape.
Just like, and you have I was gonna say, you even have like the Scottish. There's like a Scottish like side character in The Great Escape, and you have like the Scottish chicken.
Oh yeah.
And he talks about Argyle Street at one point, which I was like, whoa, was not expecting. Oh, yeah? It was not like Glasgow's never mentioned, but like Argyle Street is, and I was like, that's
very specific.
Yeah, it hit like strangely close to home. I was not expecting a part of Glasgow to be referenced in the middle of a 3-hour epic about people escaping a Nazi camp. But there you go.
That's funny.
But yeah, and of course there is the obviously the scene you were talking about before with Ginger in effectively solitary confinement and like passing the time with the tennis ball, calling back to
Yeah.
Steve McQueen in The Great Escape using the baseball. But yeah, hens make for more interesting.
Does he use a baseball?
He uses a baseball,
Yeah.
in true American fashion.
I guess that's funny. Is he? So yeah, and then of course like tennis, you've obviously got Wimbledon, which is very British. So I love to think that they were like, what's more British than it? Why would they wouldn't be? She wouldn't have a baseball.
Yeah,
because why would
I know,
you?
It's kind of funny that Chicken Run feels a lot more British than The Great Escape does, but The Great Escape also has like predominantly British cast or British characters, so it's kind of strange that it feels so much more American than Chicken Run, which just feels. But it's like they haven't really done. I mean, you still have like an American character in Chicken Run as well, so they haven't really done much in terms of like changing like nationalities and stuff. But it just feels like Chicken Run just feels like in essence substantially more British.
It does feel very British.
Yeah, I guess that's.
I think even the concept, even like the concept, like let's do Great Escape, but with chickens.
Yeah.
I feel like that in itself is very British.
I would have loved to have been there when that pitch was first said.
I read somewhere that was their actual pitch, and it's quoted here: "We'll do the Great Escape with chickens." Is what they said. And someone was like, "Yes."
Well, they absolutely nailed it, and again, in my opinion, they surpassed the original. So, massive props.
What more could you ask for?
Exactly. Sorry, Steve McQueen. You should have been a hen. Anyway, on that note, I think we should move on to the third pairing, which is another obviously rotation of genre, going back to the sort of horror aspect of things. The next one we talked about was Stanley Kubrick's only horror film, The Shining, and Robert Eggers. I guess it's kind of horror. The Lighthouse, which came out last year, starring Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe. So you've obviously just seen The Lighthouse for the first time, haven't you? So I'm curious. Yep. I'm curious how much, and you obviously went in because this suggestion was mine, and it kind of struck me about halfway through watching The Lighthouse that I absolutely adore The Shining. Like I've always loved The Shining. But yeah, it kind of struck me halfway through the Lighthouse. I was like, I am getting a lot of The Shining from this movie, and not in like an you get so many movies that like have references to The Shining, like from Toy Story to Ready Player One, and a lot of the time the movies are very, very obvious with their referencing, but I felt like The Lighthouse wasn't so much trying to reference The Shining, but just in so many ways kind of carried the same sort of essence as The Shining, and just portrayed it in a completely different way. What did you think in terms of similarities?
I think had I watched the movie, I'd probably have needed to watch it more than once. Had you not mentioned the similarity of The Shining, just because obviously you're used to it being so obvious, and like Ready Player One, it's like that they've just taken scenes from the movie. Which a better movie than Ready Player One, but that's a different argument.
Yeah, no, I would agree, to be fair.
Yeah. I think it's got that thing as well, like the thing in Hateful Eight, where it's, again, these themes of, like, isolation.
Yeah.
Obviously, in The Shining, they're stuck in the Outlook Hotel, and in The Lighthouse, they're stuck on this small little island just in the lighthouse. And then it's kind of like the both of them have this isolation that turns into kind of, like, paranoia, and then insanity, and then kind of, like, into, like, murderous tendencies, if you would call it that.
Yeah.
So I think it's really funny. What struck me was that from the movies that we're watching, one thing that's sure to make a person go insane and murder everyone in the vicinity is isolation, which is what we're all having to do just now.
That is very true. Well, no wonder those chickens were so keen to escape, or Ginger was so keen to get out of solitary confinement.
Exactly.
She knew it was coming.
Yeah. Did you So was it like the kind of feel of it for you that you said?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of aspects of it. I think the general story of being trapped somewhere, and which again, like, I guess like you pointed out is in the thing and is in Hateful Eight as well. But that idea of like you're trapped in this solitary location, and it's just I think as well, like obviously in The Shining it's a family. It's like a father and his wife and kids, and in the lighthouse it's two lighthouse keepers, one young and one old. But I think as well as like you obviously have this like almost from the get go, you kind of see where it's going. Your brain kind of goes to like, okay, men isolated doesn't tend to work out very well, and I think that's sort of interesting thing is it very much they both go down the same route of you end up resorting to violent outbursts. I think there's an element of like sexual outbursts as well. But both the Shining, I suppose the Shining movie does have it as maybe in different ways from the book with like the woman
In the bathtub.
room 237, yeah, exactly. And yeah, there was meant to be an element of like sexual tension between Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson in the Lighthouse. But I think as well as like as well as just the sort of the essence of the story being the same. Obviously I think one of the things that hit me is like both movies have a lot of ambiguity about them. Both movies are sort of like posing a lot of questions and what they're like depicting. You're not really sure, and I think you're not really sure how literal everything you're seeing is. Which is again one thing I absolutely love about The Shining. I first saw the movie when I was about 14, and I wasn't that impressed by it, but only because by the time I'd seen it, I had seen all the major scenes like parodied, mostly in like The Simpsons, but in other media so many times that it didn't feel like there was really that much new there. It was only when I kind of started researching movies in general, but researching The Shining and finding out how many sort of details are packed in there and all these little clues that are almost like they're never really explained what they mean. You're just kind of left to draw your own conclusions, and that's what I always love about watching The Shining. That's why I continue to rewatch it, is because there's so much in there that you can like pick apart and kind of determine down to even like I remember reading a thing that apparently every scene in that film with Jack Nicholson and the ghosts, there's a mirror behind where like the ghost will be standing. And if you watch his eyes, he's more kind of looking at his own reflection than he is actually looking at the ghosts. And it's another just cool. Like it's absolutely brilliant, and it's just such like an insanely like tiny detail. But Kubrick was obviously like so big on that, and the Lighthouse as well is like all the way through. You're just kind of like you're not really sure what's happening, and you're not even entirely sure of like, okay, am I just seeing this character's perspective? Am I seeing like sort of metaphorical like a version of events, or is this exactly what's happening? You're not even really sure which characters to trust, because obviously like the two characters kind of like contradict each other, and they both sort of lie, and it's just watching The Lighthouse for the first time, like all I could think was I need to rewatch this movie, but in like a really good way. There's some films you're watching and you're thinking I will need to watch this a second time, but you're not really that excited by the proposition. But yeah, like The Shining, I feel like The Lighthouse very much begs rewatches, and it feels like it's even like the sort of down to the framing and every the way it's sort of structured, there is a sort of haunting aspect of it, and it feels like the movie is like so tightly constructed that it is kind of begging you to just like pour over every single frame and try and uncover its secrets or untangle like the sort of knot that it tells. So yeah, like again, I was very surprised seeing The Lighthouse for the first time because I didn't really know that much about it. The fact that I ended up getting such strong Shining vibes, but I think it's the most, and it's almost like my love for the two movies is the same. Because, and again, like The Lighthouse, it almost feels like it does such a good job of embodying the sort of essence of The Shining because of the fact it doesn't feel like it's trying to at all. It's kind of based. The Lighthouse is based on like
that's true.
An actual sort of true story of two men trapped in a lighthouse, and Robert Eggers, when writing it, he's just like ridiculously slavish when it comes to period details, and he said he wasn't even really aware until he was like, I think he'd written like a draft or two that he'd written a story effectively about like masculinity and like the dangers of that. So I feel like the connections to The Shining were probably more like unintentional, and were probably more just in the fact that again, like sort of the thing, The Shining has like seeped into so much of pop culture, and probably influences like so many sort of creatives that it's almost, I'd imagine it would be near impossible to do a story about someone trapped in a location without evoking, or at least like a small
Yeah.
body of people trapped in a location without evoking The Shining.
Yeah, exactly. I think as well, like you were saying there about it not being obviously taking influence from The Shining. I think that was, go back to that Ready Player One. My issue with that is that I wanted to watch The Shining because I saw those clips and I was like, oh, aye, that's a better film. I would
Yeah.
rather be watching The Shining.
Yeah,
It didn't, like, it was just those were the best parts of that film in my opinion, that
I agree.
when it was just blatantly from other films.
Yeah, and that's yeah, and that is, I guess, the sort of trap that so many movies fall into, is because The Shining is a classic. I mean, it happens with like other films, not just like with The Shining, but because like you have movies like The Shining that are classics, it's then very easy and it's very kind of cheap, but very easy to just be like, okay, well let's actually revisit The Shining and let's actually go inside that movie and pull apart scenes from that movie, and then you're guaranteed to kind of get a kick out of the audience. You know, you're watching that. When I watched Ready Player One, I was like, that's pretty damn cool. But at the same time, like you say, as much as you do enjoy that, you're almost like guaranteeing that movie's never going to surpass the movie that it's referencing. I guess, yeah.
That's true, that's a good point.
And it's kind of the danger of being so literal with your referencing. Whereas again, like, the better way to go about it is taking the spirit of what was made and going, okay, well, why does that movie work? Not like, okay, you watch The Shining and you're like, this works on so many levels in so many different ways. But if you actually figure out from like a sort of story perspective, if you go back to the drawing board and go, okay, what was the essence of that story? Why is that a compelling story? Why is it like, because The Shining is a very simple story at its core. And rather than going like, rather than going crazy into like obsessive detail about why it worked and pulling that apart, it's just like they've gone, okay, well, here's the essence of that. Let's translate it to a completely different setting, completely different characters, even completely different visual style. Like the Lighthouse is obviously like sort of boxed in frame and it's in black and white. So like you look at two frames of those movies and they couldn't look further apart. The Shining is literally
true, yeah.
famous for its use of red and blood and stuff like that. So Shining's like, it makes the most of its colour, whereas the Lighthouse just gets rid of all of its. But even then, you do still have like some visual references. Like I'm pretty sure in the Lighthouse is a scene where a character runs about with an axe, which is hard not to ever see that and go, oh yeah, The Shining.
Yeah. That's very
but
true.
Yes. On that note, on axes, we can wrap that up and move to the next pairing. Once again, jumping about genres, going back into the sort of comedy side of things, and looking at Apocalypse Now and Tropic Thunder. And this is a sort of interesting one because Tropic Thunder is more about the making of Apocalypse Now than it is about the actual film. So I'm curious, how much of that are you all aware of?
I knew that I had read previously about things like Martin Sheen. He like had a heart attack really at some point, and he was relatively young. He was, I think I read, what, like 36 or something.
36 exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And there was all kind of problems. There was shooting problems. Was it not something ridiculous like 16 months they were shooting for when it was meant to be like 5 weeks or something?
I think in terms of days it was something like 268 days, but I'm pretty sure they had to halt production because they literally had like floods in I think it's the Philippines where they're shooting. And like entire like sets that they built were just completely like swept away. There was like loads of issues with the script and the writing, and obviously like,
and then they had Marlon Brando.
Exactly, yeah. Turning up overweight, which apparently Francis Ford Coppola was aware that he might turn up overweight, because when he was hired he was overweight. But then apparently the biggest issue with that was the fact that Marlon Brando was really shy about the fact he was overweight, so he couldn't even like write the character.
Did he not? Yeah, like he dictated that he was to be shot in shadows and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think he wanted to have him like, okay, he's like, well, if we're gonna have this guy, in the book Heart of Darkness, the character's supposed to be really gaunt and skinny, and that was his initial idea for the character. But when he came and he was like, okay, well, he's really big, so we'll go the other way with it, and we'll have it be that he likes to indulge in all these things, and he'll be sitting there eating like a mango and have like like sort of tribeswomen around him. But yeah, Marlon Brando was just really awkwardly shy, and it just made it like an absolute nightmare to try and work with him at all.
I think is he not notoriously a nightmare as well? Like, he doesn't learn his lines, and like I'm sure I read that he hadn't bothered to read the book. He'd like barely read the script.
Exactly. Which, and I think he got paid like 3 million or something. That was his like his contract.
I think I read it was something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but he got a million in advance as well. And on top of that, I think when they were, because obviously the filming was delayed, as we were talking about. Apparently at first when they were talking about delaying the shoot, he was one of the major pushbacks against that. He didn't want to, which is like, why? You're not even learning your lines. Like,
yeah.
You're not even going to read the book. Like, you now have more time to do those things. So like,
exactly.
Well, it's not even like, it's not like he's got in shape and he needs to worry about maintaining that. He didn't lose any weight.
He didn't do anything. Like, he literally didn't do anything. Did you not turn up late as well? So he wasn't even on time.
I think so. And apparently it was just like when they first started shooting, it was like, I think some of the last stuff they were shooting, but obviously it's the end of the movie, it all kind of hinges on it. And yeah, apparently they just sat and had like, they would, days would go by without them shooting anything, because Marlon Brando would just be sitting asking Francis Ford Coppola loads and loads of questions because he hadn't read the book or the script or didn't know what he was doing. Wow. But yeah, obviously Apocalypse Now, as we sort of touched on, was disastrous behind the scenes. Obviously they went like hugely over budget, and it was Francis Ford Coppola's own money. He had like his house and stuff and all on the line. So it was literally like, I think he talked about that, like he was asked, did you ever consider like just walking away from the project? And he's like, well, I couldn't, because all of my assets, all of my life was tied to it. Like, he did talk about the fact that he considered shooting himself and he considered jumping off a bridge at one point.
I'd read that he apparently he was threatening suicide several times during production.
Yeah, I think heavily thinking about it, you're probably jealous of Martin Sheen when he had the heart attack. Why couldn't it be me? But
exactly, he's just a young man. God damn it.
Yeah, exactly. I know, and I think looking at it, even watching like behind the scenes interviews and stuff, it does look like his weight kind of jumps about as well. It looks like he was a much heavier guy when they started shooting, and by the end of the shoot, he had lost like a fair bit of weight just from like the stress of the production, I think.
That's crazy.
Yeah, very much so. But yeah, obviously.
I think
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Tropic Thunder obviously makes fun of stuff like that. Like, I've read things about it, like Ben Stiller as well. I mean, like, the reason he made Tropic Thunder is because he thought it was funny that people would relate making a movie about the Vietnam War to being in the Vietnam War, where he's like, it's just a movie. Like, do you know what I mean? I think that's really funny, like, because he's right, it is just a movie. You having a hard time shooting a movie and having your house in California, having to remortgage it, isn't quite the same as someone who was
actually be in a jungle. I suppose like in Coppola's defense, they did say, and granted I don't know how big the threat really was, but they did say there were military personnel on the set or on location when they were shooting, and there were points when they said that they reckoned there was like insurgents or there was like there was people with bad intentions very close to like the sort of where they were filming, and there was obviously like the helicopters they were using were being used to fight like an active conflict at the same time, so they would be.
I saw that because sometimes they would have to take them away to like actually fight.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
and then
crazy.
all the pilots, like you couldn't even like train pilots to like choreograph the shots, because every day it would be different pilots, because they would all be going off and fighting and potentially getting shot.
That's crazy.
But I think George, I always sort of took. I haven't really looked that much into the behind the scenes of Tropic Thunder. It's just what I've just from the story they've told. I kind of assumed it was obviously parodying the fact that because one of the first ideas for Apocalypse Now was George Lucas, I think, wanted to actually go into the Vietnam jungle with like a skeleton crew and just kind of do it guerrilla style. But I think there was incredibly high chance that he was just going to get killed if he did that.
Not ideal.
Which, again, like I guess Tropic Thunder riffs on with them accidentally landing in an active battle zone and the director stepping on a mine.
Standing on a landmine, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously they even have like at the opening of the start of Tropic Thunder, the scene that they're shooting they have like a napalm strike go off and the cameras weren't rolling, and they talk about like how I think it's interesting as well because obviously there was a bit of a media storm around Apocalypse Now as the shoot went on forever and ever, and that was obviously adding pressure. But that was at a point when that was at a time when, you know, journalism wasn't as fast, wasn't as like pervasive. You didn't have like mobile phones and satellite technology everywhere, so there was a bit more privacy afforded to, like, you know, it was a lot of rumors and stories and just them being aware because this crew had disappeared for such a long period of time. But I guess like Tropic Thunder does point out if that were to happen now, it would be an absolute nightmare. It would be inescapable because there again phones and stuff everywhere. The press would be so aware of it.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point actually. It was funny as well, like the when they're blowing up like all the trees along the front. Was that not, did Francis Ford Coppola not just have one take to do that in because they were actually blowing it up?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, and I think that was. I think the napalm strike was originally going to be. I think there's two because there's like a close up napalm at the start, or an explosion, but I think there was like one that they were going to use for the ending and ended up chucking, which I think is why they kind of just put it in at the start. Because they were like, well, we've spent a lot of money blowing a lot of things up.
Yeah.
Probably use because there's even he talked about the fact that he got really resentful of they had this scene set and like a kind of restaurant, and there was like French or like I think there was like a kind of restaurant. There was like French people living there, and yeah, I think he just called it the sort of French diner scene, and apparently at that point like they were obviously hitting more and more like production problems, and he said every department was kind of scaling back like their costs because they had to, you know, in order to keep the production going. Apparently the art department refused to, so they ended up on this like extremely lavish set with all these like really expensive like details and stuff that he just didn't really need, and almost like he ended up like resenting the scenes so much that I think when they were shooting it after they wrapped, he was like, yeah, forget we did this, it's never going to be seen, it's not in the movie.
Wow.
I know, cancelled that whole section of the film out of spite.
That's hilarious.
I know. But yeah, no, Tropic Thunder, again, it's kind of surprising, I guess, that it took as long as it did for someone to do Tropic Thunder to actually go, you know, that's quite a funny story. The fact that they went to make a war movie and almost everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong.
Yeah.
And I do like, yeah, Tropic Thunder's hook of like the actors just like not realizing that they're not shooting a film and being in the middle of actual conflict.
Yeah, because there's that funny bit at the beginning, like just after they land, and Ben Stiller's like properly giving it all this, and the people are watching from the trees and they're like, oh god, they're serious down there.
Yeah, they don't even realize they've got like loaded guns, do they? And he's just like spraying bullets into the trees. I think even when he's being tortured, that's when he kind of starts to realize that.
Oh, because he's shouting for the director, isn't he? He's shouting for them to cut.
But he's still and I like how they sort of play up the whole rivalry of him and Robert Downey Jr. and it's almost like the two of them just refuse to break character ever because of the fact that the other one won't.
Yeah.
And that sort of like petty rivalry kind of fuels the fact that every scenario in that film happens really where like they get so involved in the conflict that's going on.
Yeah. That was funny.
But yeah, I know. Anyway, I feel like that adequately covers the connections between Tropic Thunder and Apocalypse Now. So to move on to the second last pairing, we're going to go with the lovely classic Citizen Kane and obviously the very contemporary Mank. So I'm guessing you said you'd seen Citizen Kane before, yeah?
Yeah. And of course, I watched it when I was a film student.
I only finished
watching.
I only finished watching Citizen Kane like a month ago, so I was way behind on that one.
That's terrible.
And obviously, I just watched Mank a couple of weeks ago as well. What did you think of Citizen Kane? What did you think of Mank? And
I think I do like Citizen Kane, and I think when I watched it originally, I was like proper like second year of uni, so I liked it in that insufferable film student way. But I genuinely do like it. I think it's a really good film. And then when I watched Mank, of course, found out that it was a Fincher. So that piqued my interest. I think it was good because I think maybe more so than the other ones, it was, it kind of took influence from it in a very kind of like nice kind of poetic way, where it took different elements of the film and just made it so that Mank is a really good film on its own, and you can tell that it's influenced by Citizen Kane, but like it stands up on its own maybe without having seen Citizen Kane.
Yep. No, I completely agree. I was actually really surprised at, again, Citizen Kane has such a legacy behind it, and such a reputation, and is like so revered, and I knew almost nothing about Mank other than the fact that it was, it was sort of black and white, it was Fincher, and it was based, I knew that it was about Citizen Kane effectively. So I expected Mank to lean way more into the Citizen Kane-ness of it, and I'd almost like, I guess like we were talking about watching things that like Ready Player One, like leaning so much into The Shining. But yeah, it's very much just like, okay, well, here's a story about like the creation of this absolute masterpiece, but that in itself is like an interesting story of this one man, and the sort of connections and relations he had, and it very much again just sort of like it's really clever in the way that it sort of takes once again, I keep saying the essence and the spirit of these things, but it does take like the essence and spirit of Citizen Kane, and that core concept of like a being about this like one man, and even like the non-linearity of it, the fact it's obviously shot in black and white, and and even like I was looking at a thing and behind the scenes thing, and they talked about the fact that when they were doing the soundtrack for it, they went out their way to get old recording equipment so that it sounded like it was like authentically from that period. And it manages. I could have watched Mank without ever having seen Citizen Kane, and I could have enjoyed Mank just as much. Which is like massive credit to that film. Like, it is just a good film in its own right.
I think it's interesting because I've completely forgotten what point I was going to make now. Like you were talking about the kind of jumping about in time, like the non-linear narrative. I think it was funny because they specifically spoke about the narrative in Citizen Kane and how it was never going to work while they were doing it in their own movie, which was it was pretty like meta, but I think it worked.
And it's always kind of entertaining as well, just seeing like how watching like a sort of biopic thing where they talk about like, oh, this thing will never work, and the thing that you're watching only exists because of how much it did work. The fact that it's still being talked about today. But I mean, I think one of the things that actually is interesting is, so the script for Mank, which I thought was like absolutely brilliant. Like, when I watched Mank, I genuinely was, the thing that I was like so hooked by and so constantly like blown away by was just like how clever I thought the writing was and how clever I thought the dialogue was. And I genuinely remember watching Mank and thinking, I need to find out who wrote this. I need to see what else they've written. Unfortunately, it turns out it was David Fincher's dad that wrote it, and he died 20 years ago, and it's the only thing he's written. But apparently, like, so the script was written, I think it was written while David Fincher was working on Alien 3, which was his first film. So it's literally existed for like his whole sort of filmmaking career. But apparently, like, the initial sort of drafts of it had a lot more sort of scathe for Orson Welles, and like, I think it was a much more of like a sort of teardown of Orson Welles and his involvement, and which it does kind of do that to an extent. It does kind of take some of the credit away from Orson Welles, which I wasn't there at the time. I don't really know the ins and outs of what happened, but like, judging from the story it tells, that's pretty fair. He does get all the credit for, or he does seem to get all the credit for Citizen Kane, when obviously like such a big part of that movie's success is the writing. Like it's interesting that like for a movie that I expected to have nothing but like, I was expecting to just be like overwhelmed with its love for Citizen Kane. It's kind of funny that in some ways it's a slight attack on it, or was initially a slight attack.
I think as well, leaving out Orson Welles as much definitely helped as well, because it didn't, like we were talking about with Ready Player One, it didn't feel like you were watching like a Citizen Kane wannabe.
Yeah, that's very true. Because every time, I mean, the person that plays Orson Welles does a really good job of like really capturing like his voice and sort of persona. But yeah, it's almost like too distracting, like you say, because when you're on screen with the black and white and everything else going on, you're almost just like, oh my god, I'm watching Citizen Kane.
Yeah, I think as well. What my one of my favorite things about Citizen Kane is when they do like when they've got like the deep focus shots.
Yeah.
I've just always thought that was really cool. And then I noticed while I was watching Mank that Fincher like mirrors some shots as well, so that he's got like
Really?
the deep focus thing as well. Yeah,
Nice.
I think that's, I don't know whether I've noticed that because that's like my favorite part of Citizen Kane, but I just thought
Yeah.
that was, I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, Citizen Kane just seems like it's crazy ahead of its time. I think that's, to be fair, I think that was the thing that maybe why I didn't pick up on it so much was because I only watched Citizen Kane recently. All I could think about while watching it was I was just like, this movie's so ahead, like seemed to be so ahead of its time.
Yeah.
In terms of the way that it was shot. Apparently they like cut holes in the floor and stuff like that so they could get the camera low down for like specific shots and stuff. But yeah, it just felt like it was like so far ahead of its time in terms of what it was doing and the way it was doing it. That I almost, yeah, watching it, I almost didn't. I get, internally I give the movie a lot of credit for that, but then as a result, I didn't then consciously think watching Mank, oh, it's referencing Citizen Kane. I think I was probably more just thinking, oh, it's just shot really well, and this, like a lot of modern movies are, and a lot of David Fincher films are. But yeah, no, it's a nice sort of another nice takeaway. Like again, it's just a really clever way of telling that story is evoking all these like evoking all these connections to the sort of source material. But again, doing it without having it be that's all the film is, because it could have been, again, I feel like a lesser filmmaker would have just put all that stuff in there and then walked away and been like, yeah, the job well done.
Yeah.
Like we talk about Citizen Kane a lot, so we've automatically made a good film.
Yeah, exactly. I think because there was like the one bit when he's like passed out in the bed and the bottle of booze drops is obviously like a kind of like a reference to the snow globe as well at the start of Citizen Kane.
Yeah, also didn't catch that. Wow, you were paying a lot more attention than I was. I was constantly just blown
I've
away
seen
by
Citizen Kane a few
everything
times, in fairness.
that is very fair, yeah. I need to do some rewatching. I did quite happily, to be fair. Going back to what you were saying about Citizen Kane, and I was really surprised at how much I guess I had that reaction to both Citizen Kane and Mank, so they have that in common too. Was I was so blown away by how enjoyable, and how, I think that's the thing about both of them as well, is they're actually, you almost expect, or I almost expect, black and white movies to have this sort of slow, like almost like pretentious feel. And again, a movie like Citizen Kane that is revered so much, I expect it to be like really sort of methodical and plodding, but it moves really quickly. And Mank is the same, where like it feels like they really are getting in and out of scenes, which most movies try to do anyway. But you really feel it with that film, getting in and out of scenes as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and they're hitting you with like a lot of developments and characters as quickly as possible. And then obviously they're making it by swinging about like timelines and stuff like that as well. Like you do constantly, there's a nice feeling of like chaos, but like organized chaos, I guess, to what you're watching. And it all just sort of slowly, it's almost like you're watching all these like jigsaw pieces fall into place as you sort of slowly understand this character that you're presented with, like at the very start of the film. Well, obviously with Citizen Kane and then with Mank.
Yeah, that's a good point that I'd never, like the idea of it being, so Citizen Kane's obviously the story of Charles Foster Kane, and then Mank is purely him, and the same way Citizen Kane's purely him as well. That's,
yeah, exactly.
It's like such a nice way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a clever way of doing it is to go, okay, well, we want to tell the story of the making of this movie, but let's do it by looking at, okay, well, Citizen Kane's the story of a man, so like who was the one responsible for it, and again, I guess going the unexpected route of not making it about Orson Welles and making it about Mankiewicz was a nice sort of surprise, but one that I think pays off really well.
Definitely.
So yeah, on that note, let's move on to the very last pairing, which was one that was effectively pinched from. I was watching a Hollywood Reporter roundtable of writers and directors, and in it Jordan Peele actively mentioned the fact that he had based Get Out on the Stepford Wives. So that is obviously our last pairing, Get Out and the Stepford Wives, to return to horror once again. Interestingly, we watched different versions of the Stepford Wives.
Stepford Wives, yep.
I'm really glad that we did though. Like, I'm really curious because I know absolutely nothing about. I mean, I hadn't even heard of the film until Jordan Peele mentioned it, and then obviously I watched it. But I know absolutely nothing about the remake. So what are you aware of the original? You've not seen the original, have you?
No. Do you know what's funny as well? Because you had mentioned Stepford Wives, and I was like, oh yeah, I know about that. I remember being in secondary school and there being like a poster up, and it was the Nicole Kidman one. So that was obviously the one that I pictured.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until I had watched it and I was like researching it basically that I was like, oh wait, there was like an actual, like there was a horror version. I've watched like the comedy version, like the early 2000s comedy version.
That's mad.
Which I thought was funny.
Does it completely play up the comedy aspect then?
Yeah. It kind of reminded me, it was very like Tim Burton-esque.
Oh, really?
But it also reminded me of Death Becomes Her.
Okay.
But not as well done, maybe, as either of those.
Fair.
I think it was funny because the story was there. The story that had obviously, I think it was based on a book, and then there was the 70s version. So the story was there and it was good, but it was just very like, it was weird as well because it had such a great cast, but it was very like, it was very of its time, like that kind of early 2000s, like, this is kind of funny, so that'll do. And it's bright, and there's a cast of good looking people, so it'll be fine.
Yeah, it's very sort of paid by numbers.
Yeah.
I'd watched the original, which is on YouTube. Although the version I watched was like an analysis. I don't know if that was just like the excuse they used to sort of get it up. So every like, it happened like 4 times throughout the movie. It would like fade to black, and then it would cut to like these guys in an office, and they would be discussing the movie. And the first time it happened in the middle of the movie, I was like, "What?" It's like, this looks like it was shot right now. Why does it look like this is shot right now? And then I realised,
like, why did their camera quality improve so much?
Yeah, the framing and then obviously they started talking about the movie, and I was like, okay, this is an analysis of the movie inside the movie. But I'm guessing that's why like YouTube just has it up there, because like, even though the entire film is there, they do have like people in between it talking about it. But I mean, that was quite convenient because it allowed me to watch it. But yeah, like I honestly was like it was really weird how similar to Get Out is the Stepford Wives, the original. Obviously, there is kind of like, I guess, a slight comedic element to it. I wouldn't say it's a comedy, but I think just, I guess by nature of like the premise, where it's sort of mystery, in the same way Get Out is, where it's like, you know, it's about like, well, Get Out's obviously about it's like a young couple, one of them's black, one of them's white. The white girl takes the black man to meet her parents, and he obviously fears like kind of racial prejudice and their reaction, and what happens, you know, what he gets instead is so much worse with them being part of like, them basically being part of a group that literally take people, clear out their consciousness, and occupy their bodies and sort of live eternally through them. And the Stepford Wives is the story of a couple that moved to Stepford at the sort of husband's behest, and it turns out that he's part of a group who are they're taking the wives and killing them and replacing them with robotic versions of themselves. And so it's both sort of have that same idea of like, you know, the person you love is taking you to this place and you trust them, and it turns out that they're completely they have like massively betrayed you, and they are just using you to their own end. And even having like sort of, you have that mystery going on all the way through, where you're like, what is going on here? Well, like, you know, yeah, you know that it's a bit like things are a bit off, but I think the fact that the genius of both of them is because it almost doesn't really tip its hand fully on like the genre that it's going into. There's like jokes and stuff in Get Out, and there's even in like the original Stepford Wives, there's sort of like light sort of like jokey dialogue as well, which has you kind of like, it's more like a sort of mystery, and you're not really sure how deep things go, but as things unfold, they sort of get darker and more sort of twisted, and you kind of end up horrifyingly discovering how far the rabbit hole goes. But yeah, it's I think Jordan Peele talked about the fact that one of the main things is like, you know, what the Stepford Wives is using that story to address as well is like problems of like the traditional marriage dynamic and like just general sexism, and obviously the idea that you would take your wife and replace her with a robotic slave that cooks and cleans and gives you great sex all the time is pretty horrifying. And obviously Get Out, the idea that, you know, I don't like, yeah, they don't ever explicitly say that like the reasons that the group are doing what they're doing or they're targeting black people because they're black, but it is, you know, it's very fitting that it's all black people that they've chosen to take and who they've chosen to like, well, they've chosen to play host with, and it's Get Out basically does the same thing but plays up the racial sort of element, and I guess holds up a mirror to society and shows people just like all the sort of little ways in which they are either consciously or unconsciously racist, or ways that they just treat people differently based on their outward appearance.
I thought that was definitely something I took away from them both, was obviously Get Out is like you were saying, they're kind of like it could potentially be targeted purely because they're black, and then there's that kind of, you wonder, are they targeting black people because they think that they, like, does the racism go so far that they think that they as white people are just better than them, that the black people aren't using their bodies in the same way that I would be using them, kind of thing, like they don't know how to enjoy their young healthy bodies, kind of thing, where I'll take it.
Did they actually say that at one point? Does one of them say that you don't appreciate your gifts? Or is
I think the blind man does.
Yeah. Although I suppose again that then you could argue isn't a question of race, isn't it, like a racial thing? But yeah, that is very much the subtext that the movie's presenting, isn't it?
Yeah, and then the like Stepford Wives. I don't know if it was the same in the original, but all of the women, Nicole Kidman's character finds out that all of the women were very successful. There was people that were like Supreme Court judges. Obviously, she ran a television network. I think, though, is she not a photographer in the original?
Yeah, so it's not so much her job; it's just her hobby. She's like a sort of housewife, and she photographs for I think for sort of fun on the side. Because she does talk about like potentially giving it up at one point, and it seems the way that it's, I suppose either way, kind of the husband treats it as like a hobby. But yeah, I think there's with Stepford Wives, the original, it's maybe not so much about like these women having been successful as it's more about like the fact that they were very sort of liberal and I guess just like independent. You know, like there's a friendship that's formed sort of quite early on between like two of the Stepford Wives, and you know they bond over the fact that they both keep messy kitchens. They both like love a bev, and yeah, they kind of like, you know, they're very sort of strong-willed and independent, and the last thing they really care about is like cooking and cleaning, and and that obviously it then highlights what's changed when you suddenly are you encounter the robotic counterpart.
I think it's funny as well because in that Stepford Wives one, Nicole Kidman, when she first arrives, she'd be like, wears dark clothes, she's got a short haircut and her hair's dark, and then when it appears that she's been turned into a Stepford Wife, she's got this hilarious big like blonde blowout do.
Yeah, they go for
and they do this. Sorry.
Just as you were saying, yeah, in the original they do go for like the way they dress even like completely changes once they've been like, converted to Stepford Wife robots.
Yeah, because like in the one that I watched, it's Bette Midler, and she goes from like she's wearing kind of like baggy dark clothes, and she's got like her hair's brown and curly, and then it goes to her, and she's got that perfect kind of like static hair that sticks out like this, and she's wearing her little dress and everything. It's funny.
So in the remake, at the end, like, do they win? Do they escape, or are they converted?
So in the end, basically, Nicole Kidman and her husband are taken down to the thing, and the assumption is that he's turned her into a Stepford wife. So she comes out and she's all blonde and perfect. And then basically she distracts the kind of main guy who's played by Christopher Walken, his name I can't remember. She distracts him while her husband goes down the stairs and basically like breaks all the machinery so that all the Stepford wives kind of come back to themselves. Because in this one they've just got like chips in their brain. Just.
Ah, okay. Okay. So that's. So yeah, I guess. Yeah,
so yeah, he basically.
Sorry, as you said.
No, sorry. So basically, he like breaks everything, so they go back to themselves, and then there's this whole big bit that was absolutely needless with like Glenn Close, who's like the kind of head honcho Stepford wife woman, and it turns out that she was the mastermind, and that her husband's actually a Stepford husband.
Oh.
And it was weird.
It becomes very.
So basically, in the end, yeah, and then it was like, in the end, all of the bad guys are dead, and all the people, all the women seem to just forgive their husbands. I mean, they're mad, but they're like, okay.
That's
very.
I suppose it is a comedy, but.
And then it's very much just like cut to black.
Yeah, see, the original ends on like quite a horrifying note. And yeah, it's a lot sort of bleaker, and I mean, I guess it is more of a horror than the remake, but yeah, it's a lot sort of bleaker in the way it sort of tells its story, and it's interesting because one of the things that I did think towards the end of the Stepford Wives was, because obviously they're turning their wives into, well, they're replacing their wives with robots and then killing the wives, and I was just like, why do you need to kill them, like, and get out?
Yeah,
obviously,
just set them free.
Yeah, literally, like they like the wives don't even want to be in Stepford. You could just let them leave. Like,
yeah,
they're not gonna like come back for a husband that's just built a robotic version of themselves. So like, I think they could quite happily move on with their lives. But yeah, no, I was just curious because I was saying Get Out, he very much like upends the system and. Tears down the whole sort of like organisation, and I was that isn't in the original Stepford Wives, but I also know that the original Get Out had one of the original drafts of Get Out had like a much more ambiguous ending where it ended with the cop car turning up, and you were kind of left on that like question of like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, obviously the movie is telling you that it's a bad thing, but. Yeah, I was just curious if like the Stepford Wives remake had. It's interesting to hear that they do go for like a much happier ending and go in the safer thing of like, oh, it's just wee chips in your brain that you can undo.
Yeah, they can be turned off and.
Yeah, exactly.
But it is weird actually. I've just realised. So they're saying, oh, it's little chips in your brain, and they are controlled by like a remote control, and you see the bit when Matthew Broderick's trying to get Nicole Kidman to do it. You can see they've built like a kind of robot version of her because it's lying on the table. Okay. So they've never explained that.
Yeah, so they do have robots as well as chips.
Yeah, so you're like, are they robots? How does that work then if you've killed them, put their brain in a robot, and
Yeah, exactly. They just ultimately by trying to make it a nicer story, they raise a lot more questions.
I think that definitely just kind of sums up the movie. It wasn't very...
It sounds a bit messy.
Yeah,
well, I'd recommend checking out the original. The original one is like, I mean, when you go into it knowing that it's basically Get Out, it takes a lot of like the sort of thrill and the mystery out of it, and the movie is like very much it's having a lot of fun with its questions. So it does kind of lose the impact, but at the same time, like the writing of the original was like surprisingly again, is sort of surprisingly witty. I think it's William Goldman who wrote The Princess Bride. He wrote the script for it, so it's a pretty sharp script, and it's for a movie that came out in like mid-70s. It's quite refreshing, the sort of like the fact that it's quite scornful and quite judgmental and quite skeptical on the way that like the sort of husbands treat their wives. There's a lot of like, because there are a lot of moments where like I think especially early on, where the husband would say something, and I had that thing that you kind of get when you watch like generally movies from like around the 70s or like before. You're kind of like, but I suppose it's the
Yeah,
70s.
and it's just like,
yeah.
yeah,
But then like you kind of have like a threefold with that. I had like, and then I was like, but it's from the 70s, and then I was like, but the movie's actually critiquing that, so good for it.
yeah, yeah. That was
But
what I thought was interesting. Even though the movie wasn't the best, it was quite serious about what it was trying to say. Like the same
yeah,
with Get Out, where they had the issues with racism, and then Stepford Wives was very much like she's purposely targeted these kind of like high flying successful women because
yeah,
those women don't know how to please their husband or keep their
yeah.
family nice. I still thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting that like those are the sort of the big impressions that the movie's made, and obviously it's something the movie is trying to address and is trying to comment on. But I don't know if that's like I'm pretty sure the movie's doing a lot of things, but yeah, it's interesting that you don't really hear people talking about like Get Out, it's absolutely terrifying. Like usually the interesting thing about it that people love talking about is all the things that it's addressing within like society, and I think Stepford Wives, it's the same. It's
Yeah.
like it's really interesting as a lens at like that society, and a lot of the issues that exist there still persist, but thankfully much like less so. But yeah, all round like I thought the two made like for quite a good pair. Actually, I'm pretty sure Stepford Wives even
Yeah,
has a scene
definitely.
which I think where it first is kind of tipping its hand at what's going on. There's a scene about like again roughly halfway through where they're actually at like a sort of garden party, and that's when you have like one of the robots is like slightly malfunctioning, and that's the first sort of like there's something genuinely wrong here, and obviously Get Out does the same thing, where like
The
guy
Stepford Wives, the 2004 one I watched as well does that as well.
does the same thing.
They've
That's
got
the
like one
part
of them like malfunctions at a dance. Yeah,
Oh, a dance. So yeah, I guess
it's
that's
like a fair thing that they're at.
so again, which again is quite similar to like Get Out, where it's like the big sort of garden party, and that's where
Yeah,
it becomes like really apparent that okay, there's something really nefarious going on here, and something's like definitely not up. But yeah, I enjoy it. Quite enjoy as well the fact that like this just the I guess I mean it's not like that subtle, but just the subtlety of like when you meet the Stepford Wives, the way they're acting, you don't they're acting like they do act like people. They don't talk like robots. They talk like people.
yeah,
But it's just the fact that they are like too idyllic. And obviously, when you have like at points in the movie, you have like characters that have been introduced, and then you meet like the sort of robotic version of them. I quite like the sort of subtlety of the fact that obviously the characters are working out that there's been something that's happened and that has changed, but you are as well. But it's not because you're seeing like circuits and wires. It's just out of like the sort of dialogue and the interactions and the actions, and there's a lot of sort of clever writing that way. And again, Get is the same thing of like when he's when he's going around the house, and it's obviously was it the groundskeeper and the sort of maids, which obviously turns out are the grandparents, and you're just aware that they're like super off, despite not really having like anything like to show for it. They just like a lot of the way they talk and carry themselves just seems really strange, and it's that sort of subtlety of like
and like the bit as well with the young guy when he's trying to talk to him, and the guy is very much like, and he makes fun of the way he's dressed, like why is he dressed like that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly, like no, exactly. And it's just again I guess it also makes it feel, it does sort of sell the reality of it and makes it feel real. It makes it feel like it's, but yeah, it's again it's power to the filmmakers there for those sort of like subtle, it's quite sort of subtle touches that really sort of sell the point, and really really sort of sell I guess the horror aspect of it as well, that it's happening but it's not being talked about, it's being ignored, and it's almost because it's not
it's kind of like elephant in the room.
And there's that, I guess going all the way back to what we've talked about a few times, there is that element of like paranoia where you're like, is this actually a problem, or is it just like there's a degree of paranoia here? So
and there's that thing that like common courtesy, you would never be like in Get Out, he would never be like, I think your family's doing something really dodgy.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
You would just never address it. You would just quietly, and you would be on the phone to your pal, being like, I don't know what's happening here.
Yeah, exactly. It's this whole sort of social courtesy thing, isn't it? And that be almost being like trapped by like social customs, is like an interesting concept as well. But yeah, I think all in there's like a hell of a lot, in essence between the Stepford Wives and Get Out, and very much so with all the films we talked about. So
yeah, definitely.
wrapping up, are there any sort of final points? Are there even any like honourable mentions or anything that you would have liked to have discussed, or are you quite happy with everything that we've talked about, because we have talked about a good amount of films?
I have. I think the only thing when I was watching Apocalypse Now that it really obviously because I'd seen this movie first, but it really reminded me of the Skull Island movie, the King Kong one.
I got that as well. Yeah, I really got those vibes. And watching The Great Escape, I also kind of got like slight vibes of The Shawshank Redemption. But I think part of that was also me just going, well, The Shawshank Redemption was a lot better and really.
If only I was watching Shawshank.
Yeah. Again, I think The Shawshank Redemption does a really good job of actually making you understand why you really do not want to be in that prison. You want to get out of there. But yeah, I did get the Kong Skull Island vibes as well, even down to what is it? Is it John C. Reilly who's like the kind of crazy guy who's, and you have like, is it Dennis Hopper in Apocalypse Now who's like the crazy sort of photographer?
Oh, of course, yeah, because he's like stuck. Both of them are like kind of at the they like kind of stay at the ruins or whatever. Yeah, that's a good point. I knew there was something I couldn't put my finger on it.
That was no, because I was getting that sort of vibe as well, but it was when that character was introduced that I was like, that is like in Kong Skull Island. But I'd completely forgot about that until you mentioned. But then I guess like to Apocalypse Now's credit, it's probably quite difficult to make any sort of movie that's I suppose Kong Skull Island isn't like a Vietnam movie, but it's kind of filmed in those sort of regions. But yeah, it's kind of difficult to film in those landscapes without evoking Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now.
Again, yeah, exactly. So credit to those films. But excellent.
Definitely.
So I think that's a good place to wrap things up then. We have talked for an excessive amount of time, but we've also talked about a lot of films. So thank you once again for joining me. Obviously, the next podcast we have, you'll be hosting. I'm pretty excited to hear what you've got up your sleeve for this one. But yeah, for now, thank you very much for joining. Ta-ta.
See ya.